You are listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Show, with your host, the director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest on this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show is going to be Paul Angel, executive editor of TBR. If you remember when we were doing the full-length Dixie Heritage Hour, it was always our custom whenever a new issue of TBR magazine came out every other month. We would have Paul Angel as our guest, and we would go through the issue and we would discuss the various articles that were in the magazine. And we're continuing that tradition on my new show, TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. However, there was an article in particular in the March-April issue of TBR magazine that I thought would be appropriate for and of interest to our audience over here at the Dixie Heritage Show. It began with an editorial that was co-written by Paul and John Friend, basically talking about how the government is now targeting what they're calling white nationalists for investigation, for prosecution, for arrest, for imprisonment. And then there was also an article at the end of the magazine by VP Hughes, and she was talking about, for example, how the Obama administration had begun targeting white neighborhoods and wanted to integrate any neighborhood that they thought was too white because they didn't want too many white people living together. They thought that that was detrimental to the country. And, of course, she also brings up this whole thing about how the federal government is going paranoid now, trying to claim that white nationalists are a bigger threat to the country and a greater source of terrorism than Muslim extremists and other of the more prevalent terror groups. In other words, those of us who are Southerners and who are white, we've been declared to be terrorists by our own government. And so that's the discussion that we're going to have today with executive editor Paul Angel. The editorial there at the beginning of the magazine, and there's never usually a name associated with it. So tell me if I'm wrong. I'm just going to guess by reading it that John Friend was the author of the editorial Nationwide Violence, or Nationwide Leftist Violence Returns.
Sure, John and I put that together, and we used to put a name on it, but generally this is an editorial. It was always Willis's policy that this be a general statement from the magazine itself. So everybody's got a little bit input in this, but you do know some verbiage that John likes to include. But at any rate, the point is here that when we look at this, by the way, the headline of the editorial was Nationwide Leftist Violence Returns. Well, we were not shocked at all, but disappointed once again in the FBI to have made the determination that white nationalists and white quote-unquote supremacists are the greatest threat to American security, and they're the biggest group that is more likely to commit domestic terrorism. I'm yawning as I say this because it's so much baloney. And there's dangerous white nationalists are as dangerous to America as ISIS. Okay, that's how horrible we are. And we also know that the group they're focusing on now is the base, and now they're going into it, and they're trying to tie the base was some dude in Russia. I think he was an American who moved there, and now they're claiming that the Russians are trying to foment racial strife between in America, inside America, between whites and blacks, specifically by urging whites to strike at other groups and not just blacks, but also they're encouraging Russians allegedly are encouraging black groups, militant groups to attack whites. Oh my gosh, give me a break. The Russians are doing nothing to foment racial unrest in this country that the mainstream news media doesn't do 100 times worse. Is it the Russians who talk about Trayvon Martin for 6 months when it turns out that the poor old George Zimmerman had pretty much defended himself against a violent black kid who had a long history of fighting and wanting to hurt people and had a criminal past, was probably doing a concoction of watermelon iced tea and Skittles, and then that stuff that comes from cough syrup that's only a prescription now, and that makes you paranoid? Or is it them that constantly talks about how awful the cops are and how it is that they shoot unarmed black people every single day? Of course, the cops, occasionally you get a bad one in there, might do it. Do they talk about how awful it is? The cops are being targeted for assassination, or Mayor de Blasio, how awful this guy is, who seems to gloat over the fact and now trying to get himself out of a hole because he has been encouraging this violence, leftist violence, racial strife. Give me a break. So it's the same bunch of lies, in my opinion. The one group that they did talk about was the base, and this was the reason that Northam, right, Governor Northam of Virginia, used. The base was planning to attack a crowd of gun-loving Americans at the Richmond's Capitol during the gun rally, in which gun owners across Virginia showed up in droves to let him know that he better not show up in their counties, including their sheriffs who stood up for him, stood up for the people of their states. To not use the National Guard to come up in the state and try to confiscate guns. Northam says he never said it, but he certainly intimated it. Why else would you have the National Guard involved, right? You could do that with state personnel if people were just suspected to show up and turn their guns in. That being said, what was the base going to do gunning down a bunch of right-wingers who were at the conservatives who were at the Capitol? It made no sense whatever. And we find out that the base had several members who got out of it because they thought it was being used as a front group. And then we find that the group had been infiltrated by the FBI. And as I say, I kind of know how this goes. 3 or 4 guys are sitting around out in a rural area somewhere, Arkansas or wherever, and they're disgruntled with the taxes they pay, and maybe they're convinced, and they have a little militia group. Maybe they do target practice in the woods or whatever. They, generally speaking, aren't really thinking about violence until the informant shows up. Then all of a sudden they sit around and they're having a little campfire out there, and the guys say, "I really hate the government. They're just bad, right? And they're doing this to us, and they're tearing down our statues. And by the way, that's just a provocation right there, man. Everything they do, the government does is a provocation." And the informant says, "Well, we need to strike back hard." And the guy's like, "We don't really want to hurt anybody." And then the informant, "We don't have guns, that many guns, but guns for target practice, but we need something more than that." "Well, don't worry about that. I can get you a machine gun and some grenades." And, I don't know. Come on, you guys, you bunch of sissies. Come on. So before you know it, the minute more than, I think, a third person gets involved in discussing an act, becomes a conspiracy. That allows the federal government to go in there and claim whatever they want to claim. And all of a sudden, those guys are arrested, and it turns out the most violent one, the one talking about violence, the one talking about killing people, is usually the FBI informant. Well, I just heard on the news today, you see that this guy that was the head of the base, allegedly, is American and went to Russia. So here's the big Russian connection. We just got done with Russian collusion. That was a hoax. We just got the feds backing off their claim that Russia was trying to help Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. I mean, it's almost laughable. Now, look. Do some white people commit violence? Yeah, well, sure they do, I guess. Nutty ones, right? It's usually crazy people who kill people. And just what we see the violence happening on the streets today. And it's not white people. It's not white people marching. It's not white people who are attacking peaceful marchers at a free speech rally, okay? That's Antifa. That's a leftist group, anti-fascists, right? These nut job ones who bring their clubs and their masks and they hide their identities and they wear all black like paramilitary. And it's not white people. And white nationalists throwing bags at, well, it is, by the way, white people, because many of the Antifa members are white, so I should think conservatives. I think conservatives throwing bags of feces at people or urine or attacking them for holding an American flag or wanting to stand in front of the statue of Robert E. Lee and say Robert E. Lee wasn't some horrible, criminal. And so as we see this, we see that truly is leftists who are providing the major amount of violence in this country. I just don't see white nationalists running around causing all this trouble. And of course, then they hype it and they hype it and they hype it. Look, and one of the groups I'm involved in is the Free Expression Foundation, and you got these guys from the RAM, the Rise Above movement. Here they show up. They don't have masks on at these rallies. They haven't got clubs, right? But they're the ones, somebody comes up and somebody gets hit by, say, an Antifa member. Maybe if it's a member of Black Lives Matter, which is a leftist created group, probably created by whites. Perhaps Jewish guy George Soros there is involved in funding that, but whatever it is. And they attack the person next to them, and they fight back. They fight back, and suddenly the leftists disappeared. Never hear from them again. But these guys are locked up for 4, 5, 6, or 7 years. One guy just got 8. We're trying to help get his sentence reduced. And you look at this and you're like, what's this? When has this happened before? Well, have leftists ever caused trouble in nations before? Well, my goodness, let's go back 100 years to Bolshevik Russia when the Tsars were around before, when it was a decent country. It was the leftists who stormed the palace. It was the leftists who were behind the terror that ripped through that country and killed millions and millions and millions of people. Or Germany in the 1930s. It was generally, everybody likes to pretend like Hitler had these stormtroopers running around on the street intimidating people. I got news for you. That stormtroopers were a response to the number of communists who were killing, literally, I think they killed over 10,000 Germans in a few years in terror attacks inside that country. What about our own country? Well, we've had this before here, as far back as the Wall Street bombing. That was in the early 1900s, I believe. And then, of course, it goes in ebbs and flows. And we had the, dozens of leftist groups bombing and killing people, both black and white leftist groups, and both black and white victims and others. But in the 70s, and Bill Ayers and the Weather Underground, and you had the New World Liberation Front, the Symbionese Liberation Army, right? You had Puerto Rican independence groups bombing here. They nearly killed Truman, or they tried to storm the White House, didn't they? You had over 1,000 leftist terror bombings. What's going on here today? Not too much that we see. They try to peg every quote-unquote mass shooting on a white supremacist. But when they publish their manifestos, which if you don't get much of a chance to read them too quick, they take them down really fast because they don't want you to see that a lot of times, and I think we talked about this in a previous show, that one of these supposed white supremacists was like a big fan of Elizabeth Warren, wanted to kill Trump or something like that, and was worried about the eco condition of the planet. Does that sound like a conservative to you? Well, conservatives are worried about the future of the planet, but we're not going to kill people about it, right? And that's what the worst of it is. Talk about the Russians in the mainstream media here. The Russians are rank amateurs when it comes to trying to foment election unrest or civil unrest or affect elections here. We do it better than anybody. I should say better. It's really worse. But 60 nations, 70 nations in the past 20 years, we've had major hand. The CIA has had major hand in influencing the elections, organizing street rallies, planning phony news stories in the media. But here, not only do we ignore total leftist violence, because, I would say maybe, and I hate to even mention the mainstream news media, but Fox is the big popular one now because people are so tired of hearing from CNN and MSNBC and ABC and CBS. But we had guys actually having members of Antifa on their show to justify why they should be using violence. Chuck Todd even had this guy, Mark Bray, who's author of the Anti-Fascist Handbook, on his show to explain why violence against Trump supporters is necessary. This is absolutely insane. And that was one good example was that guy Keith Ellison, who's now he's the current Minnesota Attorney General, and Maxine Waters were shown on Facebook pictures with some of these big violent leftists. So I ain't buying it. I'm worried that there's going to be, if a Democrat gets elected, they might be, although Joe Biden doesn't seem to be overly leftist. He's as far as radical, probably a little too old for that. Bernie Sanders is much more such, and Sanders' followers seem to be quite willing to burn cities to the ground, as they've said, right? If Trump is reelected. So don't be expecting that conservatives are going to be the problem in the future, or even now that it's leftist violence that we have to worry about. It's always been leftist violence. I mean, can you name a time in our history in America when right wingers went out and went nuts and started killing people? Not really. See, you look at the number of mass shootings and the number of people who died, dwarfs in comparison to the number of young black men who are slaughtering each other in the inner cities. But you know what?
We had the same issue, I guess back in the 1960s, 1970s, and it was the same basic crowd of people that was stirring up the pot back then as well.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Well, what I find interesting is you talk about, it's the FBI that's now targeting, what they're calling white nationalists. And, I guess now if more than 3 white people gather together in the same place, they're going to have to be investigated. I thought that the FBI worked for the president, and so this is basically the Trump administration that's doing this. This isn't the Obama administration that's doing this. This isn't, the yet-to-be-elected Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders administration that's doing this. This wasn't Hillary Clinton won the election, and now this is happening. This is the Trump administration that is coming after white people.
I'm not so sure that the FBI works for the president. I mean, they've been behind trying to take him out of office since he got in. I also know that the FBI likes to justify its own existence by hyping and creating these problems. And need one forget that when they bombed the Trade Center the first time, the second time was the airplanes, but when it was at 93 with the blind sheikh, it was the FBI who provided, and by the way, there's the CIA involved too. I think it was the FBI who provided one of the missing links and as an informant with that group of Muslims. And there was a Mossad operative in that too. Everybody knows this is true, and don't have to say I'm some type of a lunatic. Go look up online that if these guys had planted their bomb properly in the truck bomb in 1993, the Trade Center might have partially collapsed then. And who provided? It's the same old story I was talking about earlier, right? A bunch of Muslims get together, they're disgruntled, they start talking. Oh, we don't know how to build a bomb. Well, FBI informant comes in and says, we can help you with a bomb. I want to hurt the United States too. And the Mossad agent's like, oh, I can help you out too. And the Muslims think it's fellow Muslims. Before you know it, they've been conned into having some big terror event. And all of a sudden, the FBI and CIA and all the intelligence groups say, see, we told you so. But to say that these guys, and by the way, I don't know about Trump. I mean, who knows who's making decisions for him sometimes. I think his statements on Charlottesville were indicative of what he truly believes, and understand there really were good people at Charlottesville, and the only bad people there, I won't say the only bad people, let's be reasonable, but a good portion of the people at the Charlottesville rally around protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue were federal informants. How do we know this? Because the FBI refused to investigate both sides, the left and the right, the conservatives, the white nationalists who were marching, and the Antifa members, because of the number of federal informants who might have been exposed in a probe. To say that guys like McCabe or Comey are working or were working, they're gone now, or even Director Wray are working in the best interests of the president or under his direction, I'm not buying it. And
so
I think
what is it about the FBI that a president, you would assume Trump would be a stronger willed president. So why can't he just get a handle on it? I mean, what is it about this agency that enables it to basically be its own rogue?
Well, you remember the CIA in the 60s. I don't know if the president knew what they were doing.
Well, that might be true, but in this case, we know what he's doing because it's in the newspaper.
Well, he's talking about the base. So if what you're saying is Trump is behind the effort to expose and destroy white nationalism.
Well, I'm saying that either he's leading the charge, or at the very least, he's refusing to call off the dogs. In other words, if he's not ordering the dogs to attack, at the very least, he's refusing to hold their leash.
Well, I also will say, and you could be right. Again, I don't know everything, and I certainly don't know what's going on inside the NSA, CIA, and FBI. As I'm going to tell you again, there's lots of good agents out there who really are doing a great job and trying their guts out to make and believe that they're making America safer. But there are rogue agents out there, and rogue organizations, as we know from the 60s, and the CIA and the Bay of Pigs, and the attacks on Castro or attempted assassination of Castro. We know the CIA was involved in the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. I mention that all the time, 1953, and how they did that. So who knows what's going on now? But to say that this wasn't going on, I imagine the groundwork was laid during the Obama administration. And who knows, look at the number of traitors around Trump. So can this guy know everything? I doubt it. I don't know. But you could be 100% right. Donald Trump could be trying to wipe this out or make a big deal out of it to make people think he's not a racist. And this is the only way he knows how to do it, instead of just admitting he's not a racist. Because if he was a horrible racist, they would have already put up plenty of video footage of him saying the N-word or talking about, wetbacks or whatever he's going to say. And But we know that this is true because how much stuff did they get on Mike Bloomberg in like 20 minutes, right? So, hey, who knows? We'll see what happens in the future. I just think that right now it's all part of the accepted narrative, and maybe Trump, let's see what happens if he gets reelected. If he doesn't get reelected, well, he can't do anything. If he does get reelected, he might call him off. But he wants black votes, and I think this might be a way to get them. Who knows?
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
Well, I know this was kind of the subject, and we're going to the end of the magazine now, but VP Hughes had written an article, and, she talked about, for example, Obama had even started programs, for example, basically to integrate every neighborhood in America to make sure that there were no more, shall we say, all-white neighborhoods and so forth. And so that was kind of an extension of the editorial, if you will, or maybe the editorial was inspired by her article.
The editorial was inspired by Inspector Ray's statements about white nationalists being as dangerous as ISIS. But they are related. The question is whether or not whites have anything to be ashamed of in their past, that we should be ashamed to the point of guilt-ridden impotence, okay? And so we just kind of take a look through this, and VP Hughes is also the author of a great book on Colonel John Mosby, and it's called 1,000 Points of Truth, in which he collected literally thousands of newspaper articles to talk about how Mosby had been talked about, not only by his enemies, but by his comrades at the time, and how well he was respected around the globe. And of course, you want to ruin a man, you can do it pretty quick. That being said, this particular one is an extension that starts off about the FBI informants that is totally focused on what has been identified as a white supremacist movement in the U.S. and Europe. I don't know if it's white supremacist movement or just, again, like the stormtroopers of Adolf Hitler were created to fight the leftists on the street. Okay, everybody thinks Trump was elected by a bunch of racists and that the Antifa showed up to counter this. It's the other way around. Antifa was on the street. These leftists were on the street causing trouble. And this is the natural reaction, is white people aren't going to be sit down and be beaten into submission. So really, this was kind of a tour through our history as well. And she actually talks about racial anthropology and who we've created, Shakespeare and Beethoven and Da Vinci and Isaac Newton, et cetera, our accomplishments. And we also have some great illustrations, as you know. Barnes Review is a heavily illustrated magazine in which we show some of these great accomplishments. I'm sure that we have something in our past to be concerned about, to think about, to reflect upon. Slavery, for instance. That's always a horrible thing. As many blacks as we brought here, so I'm not justifying it because I do believe slavery is a horrible thing going around the world right now in Africa, for gosh sakes. A lot of Muslim countries in North Africa are also practicing this. But everybody gets this idea that whites went off to Africa, and then we had expeditions into the interior to capture blacks in the malaria-ridden and some tsetse fly-ridden areas. No, of course not. We didn't go in there and capture them. They were brought to the coast for us by other black tribes who've been practicing slavery for literally tens of thousands of years, or at least thousands of years. We also know, should we be ashamed? Well, only as ashamed as the Muslims in North Africa should be, as they were the ones who were picking up literally millions of whites from Europe. I'm talking areas of the Dalmatian coast being almost completely depopulated, right? They went all the way to Ireland and raided, these Muslim raiders. They went to Iceland once. They went to areas of Italy and the Mediterranean and everywhere, and they took these white people and they enslaved them, and they made them sex slaves for the girls and the farm hands and stone cutters or whatever else they could get at them, whatever they were suited for, and millions of whites were enslaved by Muslims. Do we think that whites should get reparations payments? Not really. That's just not the way we do things. We kind of say, here's the hand that's been dealt. We're going to move on forward, and we're going to create greatness. And we have. 30,000 years ago, we were painting these paintings on the caves of Altamira and Lascaux there in Western Europe, and some of the paintings there are as sophisticated as anything you're going to find in the National Gallery of Art in the East Wing in the modern section, which is basically a lot of trash, quite frankly.
Well, you were talking about how there was this airbrushed painting of a buffalo in a cave, and we didn't see airbrushing again for thousands of years.
Yeah, I know. Not only that, well, I've got a book I've got to read now we're carrying called The Oldest Enigma, The Mystery of the Paleolithic Cave Painters, in which they explain this culture. But we're doing this practically in the dark. I'm sure they had some oil burning lamps deep in the bowels of these caves, massive pieces of beautiful artwork, which is probably religiously related. We created Göbekli Tepe, which I mentioned. We created Stonehenge, and we went on to, Crete was a beautiful, gorgeous frescoes at Knossos. We had the Greek culture, of course, with their beautiful architecture and their philosophy. And we had later on the Renaissance, we had these domed features that what would be called Hagia Sophia. So, in Constantinople, or Istanbul, in Constantinople, I guess it once was. And the Basilica of St. Peter's, even the Taj Mahal. Now, are we racist? Well, I don't know. Any white who can't look at some Chinese art, for instance, and appreciate the beauty of it, well, then you're a racist, because other races have created some beautiful things, lots of beautiful things. And we're looking here at the Taj Mahal. Now, the Taj Mahal was not created by your typical blue-eyed Aryan, right? He was a Persian architect working for old Shah Jahan there. But you look at that edifice, and you say the thing is gorgeous, okay? But it wasn't a bright white-skinned person. And so are we supremacists if we're willing to recognize the accomplishments of the fellow humans on this planet? I say no. But what we can do is show pride in our own stuff and not be beaten down into guilt-ridden submission. Okay, we have created some wonderful things. Sure, we made some mistakes. We've slaughtered each other in the millions in World War I and World War II. And there's a great book we have on that about the secret forces behind these wars. I got a good article coming up in a future issue called Prolonging the Agony. How about the bankers and the industrialists and the politicians extended World War I by years and just excessive carnage. So, yeah, we've made a few mistakes. I always say we came over here and just basically stole North America, and the Indians weren't really doing too much with it. But we might have been able to figure out a better way to have incorporated them or rewarded them, whatever. Of course, we know that they were also pretty vicious, and so were we. So to be honest about these things, be unbiased about these things, but certainly don't be crippled by the narrative that's being foisted on us that we are the most dangerous, murderous species on the planet. The disintegration of Christianity, and it's also made some mistakes, I'm sure, but it's been a binding factor in our history, which is being chipped away now. But you just look at what we've done and appreciate it. And if you want to talk about it, whatever. But nowadays, the narrative is, if you are showing pride in white accomplishment, I've got a picture of the medieval astronomical clock in Prague, for instance, which was just an amazing thing, based on probably the Antikythera device that they found in the Mediterranean that the Greeks had made centuries and centuries ago. But you can show pride in these things and not be a supremacist. Now, if you want to kill somebody, well, then the Barnes Review isn't for you, because we can't support violence like that.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
Folks, we're out of time, so that's our show. See you next week.